Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that's going to determine what the future will bring. And I have to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They're my views, and for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. We've missed having you with us.
Well, thank you, Stan. It's good to be back in the country.
All right. Well, it's good to have you. So what are we going to be talking about?
Well, let's first of all talk about provoking armed intervention in Syria. The U.S. and its NATO allies continue to provoke a justification for a military response in Syria. First, it was the refusal to tell the world that so-called unarmed protesters did, in fact, harbor armed provocateurs, among them who were shooting at Syrian police in order to provoke an armed response that the international media could condemn. Then there was the massive importation of foreign arms from Turkey to build up an armed resistance movement within Syria, and that was sponsored by the U.S. But the latest and most egregious has been the creation of a massacre of women and children, blaming it on the Assad regime. Well, first of all, let me be very clear, Stan. I'm no fan of the tyrannical Assad regime that has controlled Syria for decades, and who has colluded with the U.S. even in torturing people under the auspices of extraordinary rendition. But all of us must protest the use of trumped-up provocations to justify an armed intervention for what surely is in furtherance of a globalist agenda, not democracy. It should be sufficient, in fact, just to tell the truth about any tyrannical regime. But the U.S. and its allies don't dare give Syria a chance to tell how the West was complicit in keeping them in power for so many years, just as the West played ball with tyrannies in Egypt, Libya, Sudan, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Iraq, and Iran. It would also highlight an embarrassing contradiction in American foreign policy, whereby it selectively prosecutes some tyrannical regimes while letting others, much worse, like North Korea, the most repressive in the world, get off with token sanctions, outright aid in food and oil shipments, and things like that. The U.S. has even given North Korea guarantees of that there's no military option and no regime change. Now, how is that narrative? Instead of taking the high road of no provocation and no provoked intervention, mainstream Republicans are trying to out-warmonger Obama and use the evils of this manipulated massacre for political advantage. Of course, hyping intervention to those dumbed-down Americans who listen to the drumbeat of the establishment media. For example, the BBC has been caught in the past using photos of dead Iraqi children as victims of Assad to justify the U.S. proxy war and hoped-for war, according to Travis Holt at BlueRockwell.com, who had a very good article about that. The UK Guardian touts the official line, and I will interject my comments as I read what they say. Quote, the U.S. top military officer has warned Syria could face armed intervention as international outrage grows over the massacre of women and children by tanks and artillery in Hula. That's the small town where this massacre occurred. So the attribution of this massacre to, quote, tanks and artillery is simply untrue, but done so that readers can come to no other conclusion that the Syrian military must have done this. Just one day earlier, the UK Independent gave a much more detailed account, which explains why this could easily have been agent provocateurs within the opposition, not military strikes. Quote, in a massacre of unprecedented savagery that brings Syria closer to civil war, some 32 children and 60 adults have been slaughtered in villages in the Hula area of central Syria. Anti-government militants blame pro-regime gunmen for carrying out the butchery in which children and their parents were attacked and shot. Now, notice...
Hold that thought. They always love to talk about killing children. That's how they got America into World War I. It was all a lie. And they lie, and they always use children as the excuse. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is pointing out that the reports that are coming out of this place where the children were killed was that the children had their throats slit. Now, basically, of course, if the government was supposed to be doing this, and we're going in there with artillery and certainly in tanks, they don't slit throats on little children with artillery and tanks. And who controlled the town? Why, of course, it was the rebels who were being backed, certainly by al-Qaeda and certainly indirectly, I'm sure, by our own government. But basically, we can't admit that. But they're using, of course, the tragic deaths of these children. So the question is, who slit the throats of the children? Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, I am not saying that al-Qaeda was involved. Al-Qaeda is the ubiquitous excuse that everyone throws out when anything bad happens. But in fact, how does any reporter know, as I reported last week in the World Affairs Brief, that anything is al-Qaeda? Every day in the news we hear this about a drone strike hit an al-Qaeda leader. Well, does he have a badge that says I'm al-Qaeda? Does he have a card that says I'm a member of al-Qaeda? I mean, nowhere does any reporter ever do anything but quote government sources saying this is al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a myth. Al-Qaeda is a government operation that basically justifies the continued phony war on terror.
Which government are you suggesting is funding al-Qaeda today?
I'm saying that Saudi Arabia is funding it, but it's controlled through Saudi Arabia intelligence and Pakistani ISI, which are being controlled in turn by the United States government.
And I think that's the most important thing, ladies and gentlemen. You go up on the internet and check this out, and there's no question al-Qaeda is being funded by Pakistani intelligence and the Saudis, and both of those are working closely with the CIA. Why? Because they want to get us involved in another war. Go right ahead.
See, there's only one way that the U.S. government would know, that everything, or first of all, if there was anybody in there with al-Qaeda, obviously the person who controls al-Qaeda would know that. But the point is, these people are being directed to do terrorist events as a false flag event in the name of al-Qaeda. But in fact, there's people who flow in and out of the ranks of al-Qaeda, and there is no badge, there is no uniform, there is no way to tell except the people who control them. Now, that said, I believe the U.S. government and their spokesman and the compliant media uses al-Qaeda anytime they want to blame it on something. They throw that out because it serves the purpose of continuing the phony war on terror. In fact, there's no way that anybody's intelligence is good enough to know where al-Qaeda is, and every time the media reports that, they appear to know. And if you have that good of intelligence, then why aren't you taking out al-Qaeda? You see, why aren't you destroying? Why does it keep staying around if you have that good of intelligence? It just doesn't make sense. But people, of course, don't understand how intelligence works. It's impossible for them to know how incredibly ridiculous the claims are about al-Qaeda that we deal with every day in the news. So the original Guardian article continues saying, General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, added the U.S. be prepared to act militarily if it was asked to do so. There's always a military option, he told Fox News. You'll always find military leaders being, however, somewhat cautious about the use of force because they're never entirely sure what comes out on the other side. Now, that's because most are unaware, that is, our military leaders, of the globalist agenda being pursued by political leaders that order these inventions. And that's why they're sometimes shocked at what happens. They're just following orders. Now, some of them, in fact, in the military are globalists, and I'll get into that in a quote that comes out with the Council on Foreign Relations about China. But that's another story left for a little bit later. That said, it may come to a point when Syria, because of the atrocities, he said, would require military intervention. So it's obvious that he has bought into the government reports blaming all of these atrocities on Syria. Here comes the part about Republican neocons pushing Obama, who isn't resisting, by the way, into taking strong military action. The warning comes from Republicans as Barack Obama is under increasing pressure from Mitt Romney in November's presidential election to take tougher action over Syria. Romney accused Obama of weakness and disparaged his support for efforts by the former UN Secretary Kofi Annan to revive a failing peace plan. Well, of course, it's a failing peace plan. None of these are expected to succeed. What they want to do is have a failed peace plan so that they can justify the military option. Romney said Washington should instead arm opposition groups. Well, Romney is a fool who obviously has been kept in the dark by his neocon advisors that this has already been going on for months. That is the arming of opposition. Where do you think that these arms are coming from? Of course, even the Obama administration denies any knowledge of arming the opposition, so it has become the official lie. After nearly a year and a half of slaughter, again, I'm quoting from the article, Romney has no knowledge of the provoked nature of the killing. It is far past time for the United States, he says, to lead and put an end to the Assad regime. The on and peace plan, said Romney, which President Obama still supports, has merely granted the Assad regime more time to execute its military onslaught. The bloodshed in Hula makes clear that our goal must be a new Syrian government. So he's reading right out of the globalist playbook. You know, when you look at the list of his neocon advisors, it's no wonder that he's coming to these conclusions. And that's why I'm so opposed to even a non-insider like Romney having the Republican nomination, being the Republican president, to have a Republican who claims to be a conservative do the same thing to it that any other globalist would be, is just adding insult to injury. And it corrupts our own constituency. That's why it would be much worse to have Romney as the president than Obama. Just because when Obama does it, it at least engenders opposition. When Romney, a Republican, would do it, he would convince a lot of conservatives to go along. And that's why I'm opposed to the Romney candidacy, or any of the Republicans except for Ron Paul, who would get us out of these globalist interventions.
Okay, well, I certainly concur with your conclusions, and basically, of course, they've convinced us Ron Paul has dropped out, which he hasn't. He's still collecting delegates. But he's just not actively campaigning, but he is not conceded at all. In fact, he's going to be going steadily to the convention with a fair number of delegates, and certainly the idea that Romney won in Texas isn't true at all. We don't know how many delegates he got there, but the media is simply lying to us about that, as they lie about everything because they're coordinated in their efforts to deceive the American people. Go right ahead.
Well, let's take that up as a topic. I'm covering that in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief. After winning the Texas GOP primary 70% to Ron Paul's 12%, Mitt Romney has staked his claim to the Republican nomination. According to the tally by the establishment media, with Tuesday's win in Texas, Romney has now crossed the 1,144 delegates needed for the nomination. However, that tally is based on non-binding primary results and assumes Romney gets a corresponding proportion of his delegates, which is not true at all. As I have detailed in recent World Affairs Brief articles, Ron Paul has actually won a majority of delegates in several states, all of which take from Romney's total. So far, according to the Denver Libertarian Examiner, Paul seems to have taken the majority of delegates in at least 11 or more states, Romney in only 19. Santorum and Gingrich are virtually non-factors with ultimately very few delegates, to no state wins between them, except, as I interject here, that they have power to throw their delegates to Romney. At this juncture, according to one of the only sites on the Internet currently dedicated to keeping a tally of the actual delegate vote totals, Romney has only around 600 firmly committed delegates. Paul has 200. Now, that's assuming delegates would be free to vote their conscience, which I don't believe they will be allowed to do. Now, that said, I have no doubt that Romney's ascension to the nomination is secured. Both Gingrich and Santorum can assure that by releasing their delegates to vote for Romney. In fact, I fully expect that to happen in order to thwart any Ron Paul attempts to use his delegates as leverage during the convention in Tampa. And that's really the last stand Ron Paul has to build the movement, is to get time on the podium at the convention, to have a major contest, and a failure of Romney to gain a first ballot win. I don't believe the Republicans will allow that to happen. They'll actually rule this a win by de facto, by naming and by just simply claiming. And I just don't think they're going to give Ron Paul the time to take.
I cannot believe that Ron Paul only got 10 or 15% of the vote there in Texas, got as small a number as has been attributed. I wonder how much voter fraud there actually is.
Well, it has been a tremendous amount in other states that we have been able to document. But in any case, my estimate is that Ron Paul's actual support, and it's not enough to win, but it's actually about the 22 to 25% range in all conservative states, which would include Texas.
Well, but of course he is going to get an awful lot of votes from Democrats. He's going to get a lot of votes from independents. And I think, of course, it was a real fair race why he would do far better against Obama than Romney would. In my estimation, I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I think he would. But in the Republican Party, which has become, filled with a lot of mainstream people, he doesn't do any better than 25%. But he, and as I've said this in the World Affairs Brief, that he would do better nationally because he does pick up the independents and the principled left, as well as anybody who really doesn't like Obama. So he would probably do well. Now, the establishment, of course, would crucify him so that they would sway a lot of votes against him. It's very hard to beat the establishment when they have an agenda like they do.
Well, when they control the media as tightly as they do, and then they're not above certainly they go to any sort of lengths. I mean, they infiltrate campaigns. They pay people fabulous sums of money. They threaten them. We're not dealing with honest people. We're dealing with people who have a goal, and that is, of course, to bring about this one world government. They've been working for so many years, well over almost a full century at this goal. And they're not going to let one man stand in their way. And believe me, they're not above using assassination and violence. We could give you a list of literally dozens of people we personally know that they've killed in their quest for power. We'll be right back in a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Joel is simply talking about the issue of Obama having been born in Hawaii, and basically Joel points out that he was in Hawaii. They had a home birth, and then he went down, filled out a form, a short form birth certificate, saying it was a certificate of live birth, not a birth certificate. Well, Obama's mother did exactly the same thing. If the child had been born, if Obama had been born in a hospital, there would have been a long-term birth certificate. There would not have been a short-term form which his mother had filled out. Why would his mother fill out a short-term certificate if he was born in a hospital there? And of course, that is logical. And certainly as far as the announcement in the paper, all you do is go to the paper and have that filed in the paper. So Joel can certainly attest to the fact that this is not true. That, of course, recently the Secretary of State, I guess it is, of Arizona, had demanded proof that Obama was born in Hawaii. He said that the proof was supplied to him, but he won't show anybody the proof. What is the proof that was shown to the Attorney General of Arizona? Do we know?
Well, there is no proof to show. If I went to Hawaii and said, show me the proof that my daughter was born in Hawaii, all they could do was show me the certificate that I filled out and signed. That's not proof. You see, there is no proof. It is simply an affidavit by a parent stating that the child was born in Hawaii outside of a hospital. It doesn't even say outside the hospital, but they just use a different certificate. It's not actually a short form. There is no such thing as a long form and a short form. There is two types of certificate in Hawaii. One is a birth certificate that is filled out by a hospital, signed by a doctor. A parent cannot fill that out, and that is considered proof because it's got the affirmation of a MD and the hospital that they were born there. The other type of certificate is not short or long. It's simply a certificate of live birth, and it's a certification by a parent or a midwife that a birth took place, and it's only used for those outside of a hospital. She never claims to have a home birth. She falsely claims to have it in a hospital. There are no records in the hospital. So Donald Trump was correct, but it's very interesting. The Wolf Blitzer kept cutting him off, kept diverting it to other issues. For example, like name me anybody else who believes in this, meaning anybody that we would recognize, and Donald Trump was stupid enough to fall into that, saying, I don't name, as if there was something negative about naming the name. It was just a trap to divert from the actual proof. You need somebody who really understands the issue of the high birth certificate to go one-to-one, but they won't have anyone like me who really understands the issue on it. They want to simply be able to double down on the people who believe and denigrate them as birthers. And in fact, the next day, I was in the airport flying and saw Wolf Blitzer all over CNN, hour after hour at every airport television, going over this and putting out little snippets, but concentrating on why this is so much baloney that anyone should believe that he wasn't born in Hawaii, and how every one of the Republican nominees believes that he was born in Hawaii, as if that was, proof or that was evidence. It's just a propaganda campaign of mammoth proportions. And of course, it's much more than the birth certificate. They have hidden all of his records of college to show that he actually came through on a foreign visa, that he had foreign scholarship money, that he was considered a foreigner. I mean, the establishment really did a job with Obama, turning him into a United States senator, and falsifying his origin into this country. They even went through an amazing piece of debunking, Stan, about the testimony of the grandmother who claims that she was present at the hospital where Obama was born. And Wolf Blitzer had the audacity to claim that the translators come forth and claim that he mistranslated, that she didn't, in fact, she actually believes he was born in Hawaii. Now, how do you mistranslate 2 or 3 sentences to talk about things that I was present in a hospital where he was born? You couldn't make a mistake and say she was present in Hawaii. She doesn't claim to be present in Hawaii. She was only in Kenya. So you see, it's not a matter of one little word being translated. This is a whole rewriting of history that they've somehow got the translator to come out and say he mistranslated. But you can't mistranslate something that big. You can mistranslate Kenya and Hawaii, but you can't mistranslate the fact that I was at the birth. You don't mistranslate something like that.
Well, basically, it doesn't matter how ridiculous something is. If you say it over and over and over again, why, pretty soon people will believe a lie. And basically, of course, President Obama, has published a fraudulent birth certificate. Nobody wants to talk about that except Sheriff Joe, and now he is being sued. Why is the federal government suing the sheriff there in Arizona? Why? Because he's trying to get the truth out, and they've got to destroy him or anybody else who tries to bring out the truth. Well, this is Dr. Stan. I guess it's Joel Skousen. It's good to have him back with us after an interlude. But Joel, before we go on, I want you to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with your organization, how they can get copies of World Affairs Brief, and how they can get the books that you've written.
Thanks, Dan. The World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. People can get a free sample issue by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. There is a yearly subscription fee to support my work in the World Affairs Brief, and so people can get those sample copies when they decide to subscribe. And there are lots of internet sources out there, including your very fine newsletter, and I learn things even when I read your newsletter, Dr. Stan. But each of us has our own particular strong points that we can add to each other's analysis. So I do appreciate the support my many thousand subscribers give me each year. On my other website, joelskousen.com, people can see a rundown of all the books that I've written on the preparedness issue. My strategy is that as we're fighting to retain liberty, we should still prepare for the takedown that the government is planning for us, and thus I believe very much in the preparedness strategy. So I've written several books. My bestseller is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places, and it's in its 3rd edition, the all-new color map edition, and it's really popular, really selling very, very well. My biggest book is To Secure a Home. It's over 700 pages and covers everything in preparedness relative to the house, remodeling, building new, retreats. It's got it all from generators to solar power to high security walls, windows, and doors. It is the top book in the nation about securing your residence. And the last book is How to Do a Safe Room Within a Basement. It's called How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. And all three of these books are carried by Radio Liberty.
And you can get them by calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927. And they certainly among our best movers. And I will tell you that an awful lot of people are beginning to realize that we're in real trouble in America. Certainly we're facing, in my estimation, a total disruption of the structure of society. And when you understand there really are people who want to disrupt our society, who want to create problems in America, why, of course, it would be wise for people to begin making preparations. I don't know that we're going to be able to turn this around, but we owe it to ourselves, to our friends, and to our family to make preparations for the difficult times, which I am certain lie ahead. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, you know, it's a very good point that you make. Even Walter Williams kind of brought out and had an excellent article this week come out of his, he's a professor of economics at George Mason University. And in this week's World Affairs Brief, I'm talking about the failure of France and Spain and Portugal to get their debt situation in line. In fact, it's unsolvable. And once again, there's more pundits saying Spain is going to leave the euro, they're never going to be able to bail out that economy, and they're wrong. They will, and it's true that they can't bail it out completely, but in Greece, for example, they made investors take a 50% haircut, meaning a loss on their investments, and then bailed out the rest of the 50%. They don't have enough money to bail that out because precisely the European Central Bank does not have the same power that the Fed does to directly bail out other governments within the EU. But I am predicting, just as Greece has not left the euro, that Spain will not leave the euro either. Globalists will not tolerate a destruction of the European Union, which is a building block for the New World Order. And what they will do, in fact, is allow this to fester and get worse and worse because they will use the sector of destruction of the euro to say we've got to have a new EU treaty. And there have been two versions now of the revised treaty taking away tremendous sovereign powers away from the states and giving it to unelected bureaucrats in Belgium. Now, the failure of the U.S. and Europe to stop spending in the face of devastating debt loads is symptomatic of why there is no political solution, in my opinion. And I highlighted in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief what Professor Walter Williams of George Mason University said in a wonderful, if not negative, piece this week on the psychological case against democracy ever curing itself through majority rule. And it buttresses my contention that once the majority of voters becomes corrupted by benefits from government, they will never voluntarily relinquish the power to vote themselves benefits through the democratic process. The lesson Dr. Williams uses to illustrate this dilemma is absolutely critical for your listeners to hear, and it's called the tragedy of the commons. That's a set of circumstances when something is commonly owned and individuals acting rationally in their own self-interest produce a set of results that destroys everyone's long-term interest. Let's look at this example he gives. He says, imagine there are 100 cattlemen all having equal rights to graze their lands on 1,000 acres of commonly owned grassland. The rational self-interest response of each cattleman is to have the largest herd he can afford and put it on that grass to raise as much cattle on the free territory that he can. Each cattleman is pursuing similar self-interest, and it will produce results that destroy every cattleman's long-term interest. That is, the land will become overgrazed, soil erosion will take place, and destroy the land's useful, and nobody will get anything. However, what he points out is this. Even if they all recognize the danger of overgrazing, does it pay for any single cattleman to cut back the size of his herd? The short answer is no, because he will bear the cost of having a smaller herd, while the other cattlemen gain at his expense, and they'll continue to put more cattle on the land to make up for his reducing the number of cattle. So if we think of the federal government as a commons in which each of our 535 congressmen and the president have access to this free load of tax money, like the cattlemen, each congressman and the president want to get as much out of the federal budget as possible for their own constituents. Political Success, in fact, depends on bringing home the bacon. Spending is popular. Taxes are unpopular. And as long as you can deficit spend and don't have to raise taxes, that's why I've always said on your show, in other words, that we will never stop deficit spending because it's politically the most popular thing to do is to spend and get people to say, yeah, give us those benefits, give us those tax stimulus, give us highways, give us bridges, give us unemployment compensation, continue, because it's not costing anyone, at least in the short term. Does it pay, he asked, for any individual congressman to say, this spending is unconstitutional and ruining our nation, I'll have no part of it? I will refuse a $500 million federal grant to my congressional district. The answer is no, because he will gain nothing from it in the next election. In fact, he'll be attacked for not bringing home any of the bacon while other congressional districts are getting their fair share of the money. What about the constituents of principled congressmen? If their congressman refuses unconstitutional spending, it doesn't mean they pay lower federal income taxes. All that it means is constituents of some other congressional district get the money while the nation spirals toward financial ruin. In other words, there's only motivation to get as much as you can as the ship is going down. What we're witnessing, he says, in Greece, Italy, Ireland, Portugal, and other parts of Europe is a direct result of their massive spending to accommodate the welfare state, and the U.S. is joining in the same process. A greater number of people are living off government welfare programs than are paying taxes. Here's the question for us, Walter Williams said. Is the U.S. moving in a direction toward or away from the troubled EU nation? It turns out that our national debt, which was 35% of GDP during the 70s, is now 106% of gross domestic product. That is the economic value of measuring the total economic value of activity in the economy. A level not seen since World War II's massive 122% of GDP that we were spending for the war. That debt, plus our own $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities, that led Standard & Poor's to downgrade our credit rating from AAA to AA+, and the agency is still keeping a negative outlook on U.S. debt because there's no solution in sight for cutting spending. He finally says, I am all too afraid that Benjamin Franklin correctly saw our nation's destiny when he said, when the people find out they can vote themselves money, it will herald the end of the republic. Well, Dan, I'm fully convinced that we've gone past the point of no return in the corruption of the American voter. It's not only the half of all people in the U.S. that get some form of check from the U.S. government every month. That includes military, people who work for government, state and local government, or on welfare or food stamps, which is 40 million people now. It's half of the rest of the people are sympathetic to the notion of using government funds to cure all the ills they perceive. And none are willing to give up their particular favorite government scheme in order to save this nation from the inevitable collapse that is coming. They all want their share of the diminishing pie of the sinking ship as long as it lasts, whether it's Social Security, which we have a right to, it's not through welfare, we pay into it more than we're ever going to get out of it. But the problem is of why it's gone bankrupt is the government's taken the money. And also they have given more money to people than they paid in a good portion of the extent, including illegal aliens. So what is the solution? I've seen the specter of revolution raised on more than one occasion of late on the Internet among our own people. It is true that one never regains essential rights like we have lost without using force to strip socialist powers out of the hands of citizens, out of the hands of unions, out of the hands of politicians, who use the promise of benefits to keep themselves in power and in money. That said, however, revolution such as happened at the beginning of our republic could never happen without broad support and dissatisfaction among the people. And despite the fact that there is some dissatisfaction, it is only skin deep and does not arise to anywhere near the level of a crisis that is necessary to overthrow tyranny. And I cited as an example the people who talked about the imminency of social unrest and the collapse, that the restaurants in this country are still full. The movie houses are still full every night. The spending at the malls is still tremendous, even though we're in a recession. There is a lot of money going out the table and still spending because of the inflationary policies of government and that trickle-down effect. And it's true that we have a selective recession. Some people are out of work, and other people are suffering, and those of us who work in the private sector paying more taxes and suffering more inflation. But still, when you look at it, you still get by, and people are not anywhere near a notion of revolution and the pain that is resolved. Unlike the former revolutions, I ask these questions to people. One, who do you target as the evil force if you should ever mount a revolution? Where is the discernible enemy? Who do you rise up against? Now, as much as I've studied this global conspiracy, Stan, I can't give you a definitive list based upon public statements of proof that name names that are worthy of a death sentence. I can give you who I suspect. I can give you who show through their actions that they must be globalists because they continue. But when you look at illegal acts, you can't get the proof. And why can't you? It's because we need the collusion of government to wiretap these people to get the proof of conspiracy. And there's no clearly identifiable King George to target. It's not enough to say throw all the rascals out of Congress, because that blanket strategy would also eliminate the dozen or so true fighters of liberty that still remain. And it's still just as easy for the voters to elect other corrupt people back into Congress. It doesn't solve it by having replacing everybody every 2 years or even every dozen years. That's what makes our situation so difficult and why resistance is so futile. The enemy is hiding behind the veil of national security and working through puppets who don't actually make the larger decisions and who are protected by judges who act out of a variety of bad motives, all of which are outside their powers of discretion. In the end, if you don't have the subpoena power to get the proofs of conspiracy through wiretapping and can't rely on the courts to penetrate that veil of secrecy within government, you can't target the evil leaders directly. That leaves us with an us versus them mentality, meaning them, the majority of people who still want to give power to government to steal from the productive class through taxes and through deficit spending. And we are simply vastly outnumbered. Ultimately, that leaves us with little choice to continue what we're doing, which is, one, building our numbers through education. We're doing what we're doing this very hour, converting those with a good conscience to recognize the problem for what it is. And the education must not be that the problem is Obama. The education must be that there's a vast conspiracy of control and power against liberty. That is something that we must target. And two, we must prepare for the inevitability, in my opinion, of eventual war, which the powers that be will bring upon us in order to herd free peoples into a new world order that they control, and preparing for the social unrest that will ensue because of that war. And those powers that be are preparing for war. They're building vacation retreats in Aspen and other resorts in Colorado in the mountains, and where they have their wealth stored. They have bunkers underneath the ground, and they know that something coming. It's not just terrorism. And we need to prepare to escape and evade the roundup of the anti-New World Order dissidents that will surely come someday. That's why concentration camps are being prepared on dismantled military bases, which the government still keeps control of. And if I'm right, Stan, that there's little hope of saving the whole country as presently constituted. We are in a political gridlock now, and there's absolutely no way that the voters will tolerate any serious cuts in government spending. That's why government simply will not seriously cut spending. We will see a continual downhill slide as one succession of politicians after another promise solutions, none of which will ever be instituted unless they call for yet more control and more government bailouts and interventions. Even Ron Paul would be powerless to gain the assent of Congress in order to do what is right. But there may be hope in crisis. Perhaps in every crisis, the powers that be are planning to bring upon us the resulting social unrest that comes from war, nuclear attack on America, will force good people to flee the cities and seek refuge among like-minded people in rural areas where it may be possible to gain a partial majority status needed to control the destiny of local freedom. That's why I applaud, the efforts of Pastor Chuck Baldwin. He's moved out to a safer place. Montana, for example, he's rallying his supporters to move there. They've started a new church. Now, they are getting the attention of the establishment who are targeting them. Sometimes you get pushed out of a region like the Mormons did when they moved into areas and tried to take over in a conservative way. But that's the only solution that I see, is banding together in local areas where we can have political control and preparing to survive what's coming.
Well, I think you've done an excellent analysis. I couldn't disagree with anything you've said at all, Joel. Only, of course, I do believe that somewhere in this whole scenario, this God, I don't know how God's going to intervene. Maybe he's going to let this whole thing fall apart. After all, if he's just, he's going to bring a judgment upon this country. We live in fascinating times where we are called upon to do our best. It's an excellent, excellent analysis of the tragic situation that has come about because of the greed of the American people and the abandonment of our Constitution. Well, this is Dr. Stan. I think that Joel's analysis is very good. I think that we're facing insurmountable problems because, of course, everybody wants to be free. But how many people out in the listening audience who are getting government help will be willing to give it up? How many people are willing to give up their Social Security and give up their Medicare? And you'll find very few people are. And yet, of course, eventually the whole house of cards is coming down, and all we can do is make preparations to help ourselves, our family, and our friends, and it's going to have to be done locally. Now, I think that if Ron Paul were to get in, he might be able at least to preserve an element of Social Security and transfer responsibility for Medicare to the people with vouchers for their health care, and then, of course, some sort of block support to the states, at least on a temporary basis for the people who could not afford the health care elsewhere. But there's no way in the world we're going to be able to continue finance what we're doing. Nobody wants to raise taxes. Nobody wants to cut government spending. We're spending 43 cents out of every dollar. Suddenly it has to be borrowed. And the whole house of cards is coming down, ladies and gentlemen. If you go to Spain today, they've lost something like over $82 billion has been pulled out of the banks. They're having bank runs in Spain. They're having bank runs in Greece. They're having certainly bank runs in Italy. So the people in Europe are desperate, looking for some place to put their money. That's why, of course, they're investing in the dollar, which is the reason the dollar is going up. But the dollar is even worse off than most of the other areas, but people don't understand that. There is the perception that the dollar is safe, and it is not. It is a fiat money currency. Remember what, of course, certainly was told to Lindsey Williams, Ken Fromm told him, when, not if, the euro collapses. When the euro collapses, you have 2 weeks to get out of the dollar. So make your preparations now. We don't know. The euro may not collapse for a week, a month, a year, 2 or 3 years, but far better off that you're a year or 2 years too early than a day too late, because once they've destroyed the value of our currency, those people who are in dollars-denominating investments will lose everything. You need to get my talk on the financial tsunami and the financial Armageddon. You need to get Ed Griffin's wonderful book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. You need to get my little pamphlet on the history of money and my little booklet. They're only, I think, $3.95 each plus shipping, on prophetic warning. It is Andrew Jackson's farewell address in 1837 when he left the presidency, and certainly his warning about what lay ahead when the bankers come to rule America. Well, the bankers do rule America. We carry a book written in 1899. It's called The Final Battle, about when the bankers control America. They control it today. But all of these people have missed the fact that behind the banking industry, at least the 6 major banks that control our Federal Reserve System, and 60 to 70% of all the banking assets in the United States, behind them are powerful spiritual forces. And because people don't understand, we're primarily involved in a spiritual battle they can't understand what's going on today. So all of these items are available by calling 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. We ask if you're out there listening to us across America and you're in a position to help us financially, that you remember Radio Liberty, either by advertising with us or certainly by joining the Radio Liberty family of supporters. And then we ask you to pray for America, to pray for our leaders, our ministers. We ask you to pray for Alex and Joyce and John Leffler, and certainly Chuck Chris Meyer, and certainly for Butch Paul. But please pray for Radio Liberty, our provision and our protection.